Welcome. My name is Catherine Henshaw. I have the honor and privilege of welcoming you here this evening to Science Fiction and Climate Crisis. Wah! We're really excited to have our special guest speakers here this evening. Very happy to be engaged in conversation with them and with you on a really important topic. Something that impacts every living creature and every immaterial object on this planet. So perhaps we can get some insight here tonight. So I represent the Center for Ideas and Society at the UC Riverside campus. The center is one of the co-hosts of this event. I want to call out all those hosts, but before I get to that thank you portion, I'd like to pause here with you all and invite you to join with me in acknowledging our debt of gratitude to the Cahuilla, the Tongva, Luiseno, and Serrano peoples. These are the first peoples in the area in and around Riverside that have cared for the land, water, and air in this area for untold generations. And we owe them a debt of acknowledgement and gratitude because our feet are on the ground that they have been tending. And so we acknowledge that debt here with you. We invite you to join with us as we co-labor alongside them and their descendants as they continue to care for this land. And we pledge to continue to honor that debt and to carry this work forward into the future with their future generations. So welcome on that note of gratitude, grounded in the place where we are and wherever you are as well. So as I said, I'm one of the hosting partners from the Center for Ideas and Society. Our co-hosting partners, I want to call out the Speculative Fictions and Cultures of Science program at UC Riverside. The director, Sherryl Vint, you'll be hearing from her in just a moment. She's done a fantastic job coordinating this new series for us. The series is called Science Fiction and we're asking authors and critics or scholars in the area of science fiction and speculative fiction to think with us about major events or crises or problems in the world today and help us examine how science fiction or speculative fiction might help us imagine other worlds or see ourselves and our problems more clearly so that we could perhaps potentially work together to find our way forward. Don't want to raise the bar too high. We might not solve all those problems in each session, but we hope to have a rich and provocative discussion, as well as learning about some fantastic new works that we might want to rush out and buy at our nearest bookseller. So our additional hosts here as part of hosting this series are the Palm Desert Center. Special shout out and thanks to their crew for providing the technical and hosting support for these meetings. Special thanks to the Palm Desert partners who help support the work of the Palm Desert Center. Thank you all for your commitment of time and finances. And also special thanks to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. They're our special hosting partner as well. We're grateful to the Institute and to their members for their contribution and their commitment to continuing their learning. So we're all here to learn together. So before I hand the event over to Sherryl, I just want to give you a little housekeeping note. If you have not been in an event with us before, or if it's been a while since you've done this webinar thing, let me mention there are two buttons down at the bottom. There is a chat window. You'll see that things will be posted there. Feel free to say hello to each other. We'll be dropping some links to additional resources throughout the course of the meeting. Feel free to use that to say hello or follow those links. If you have questions, and we hope you do, and we hope to get to those really robustly toward the end of this session here tonight, please put those, instead of in the chat, please use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. That will just help us weed out the questions so we can actually see them and they don't get lost or buried in the chat, so that your metaphorical voice, your typed words can be heard, and we can try to acknowledge as many of those questions as possible. So that's it for me right now at the beginning. Hopefully you all are ready, eagerly anticipating the conversation to come. So I will hand things over to Dr. Sherryl Vint, who will take us forward. Sherryl, are you ready?
Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you for the introduction, and to all the partners for helping us organize this event. And I'm going to ask my two panelists if they will turn their cameras on now too as I introduce you. So welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be hosting this conversation tonight between science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson and critic Gerry Canavan. I'm just going to introduce both of them very briefly, and I'm going to really emphasize the brevity of my introductions because they are both so accomplished that if I took the time to give a full list of all the publications for each of these guests that we have with us tonight. We would not have time for the actual session. So Kim Stanley Robinson is an American science fiction writer. He's the author of over 20 books, including the internationally best-selling Mars trilogy, and more recently, Red Moon, New York 2140, and The Ministry for the Future. He was part of the US National Science Foundation's Antarctic Artists and Writers Program in 1995 and again in 2016. His work has been translated into 25 languages and won numerous awards, including the Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Awards, and multiple times for each of the named awards. And in 2016, asteroid 72432 was named Kim Robinson in his honor. Next, we'll hear from Gerry Canavan, who's an associate professor of 20th and 21st century literature in the Department of English at Marquette University. He's the author of the book on Octavia E. Butler from the University of Illinois Press's Science Fiction Authors Series. He is the co-editor of Green Planets, Ecology and Science Fiction, the Cambridge Companion to American Science Fiction, and the Cambridge History of Science Fiction. He also serves as an editor at 2 academic journals focused on science fiction studies, Extrapolation, and Science Fiction Film and Television. So welcome so much to both of our speakers. We're so grateful that you're taking the time to talk with us tonight. And to open things up, I'm going to ask just a really general question for each of you to respond to under this theme of science fiction and, under which we've organized our series, in this case, science fiction and climate crisis. And as a sort of to start us thinking about that, I'm thinking here of Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, which you might know, some of our audience might know, in which he sort of takes literature to task for failing to talk about climate change. It's unthinkable in the conventions of literature. And yet it seems to me that science fiction is one of the literatures that can do something different. So I'm wondering if you could each say a little bit about why science fiction can and has spoken to climate change and what you see as important at that intersection. So Stan, if you want to go first.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Sherryl, and thanks everybody at UC Riverside. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And as probably you already know, UC Riverside is one of the world's centers of science fiction studies because of the Eden Library and everything that all of you there have done with the beginning, following on the establishment of that library so long ago. Well, I mean, I am a science fiction patriot. I believe in the genre, and I've worked it in my entire career. It's how I describe myself as a science fiction writer. And of course, with the climate crisis that we now have already fallen into, and which will be getting worse, science fiction is a good tool because it's about the future. It's a basic definition would be stories set in the future, and that's what science fiction does. And then also it's very often concerned with the level of the planet. So the relationship of literature in say the domestic realist novel that you think of, if you think of say Dickens or Jane Austen or the whole English tradition, now sometimes called literary fiction. Well, that all had to do between the relationships between individuals and the relationship between individual and society, possibly history, but in very anthropocentric, very much about the human. And that's fine. Great stories are there, obviously, but science fiction always went one step further and was more biocentric, more ecological, and more planetary. The relationship between people and then society and then the planet. So it has natural advantages. And I have to register before I give it over to Gerry, and I wonder what he would say about this too, that although Amitav Ghosh is a very fine novelist, but that does, I know this personally, being a fine novelist does not equate to being good on thinking about how literature works. And his erasure of science fiction, I find very offensive. In his book, which is often quoted, he will talk about, well, I'm talking about real fiction here. Science fiction is the outhouse of the mansion of fiction. And I was a little stunned at that, given that he is post-colonial, that he's been intensely anti-imperialist in his writing. The accidental snobbery involved in that statement in this day and age, because it's kind of a statement from the 1950s, was a little stunning to me. And so I would say, give it a try, guy. Don't be complaining. So I absolutely don't like his book.
Well, I too am a defender of science fiction, so I gotta concur with that. Gerry, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Whenever I think about the Ghosh book, I think about something my friend Aaron Beatty said in a tweet, which is that all contemporary fiction is about climate change. It's just mostly about people who are in denial about it. And science fiction is a place where that denial doesn't really work, because, you know, it structures itself as like a totalizing knowledge system that needs to incorporate everything into itself. And basically every major science fiction text of the last 20 years has taken up climate in some way or another, either like in a very avowed way, like a lot of Stan's work, or disavowedly, right, in allegorical forms like Thanos or things like that. I find science fiction as a framework that is very good at putting different kinds of discourses in conversation with one another. I think that's one of the reasons why I like it, not just as a fan, but as an academic. You know, Wilson would have called this consilience. I'm given to understand that a lot of the funding agencies now are calling it convergence, right? Where the humanities and STEM can do something together. The Jesuits, where I work at Marquette, would call it integration, right? Like trying to put everything into a holistic piece that speaks to one another. And I think SF is really good at that. It's really trained its writers and its fans to think in those terms, trying to put different scales, space, and time together. I think that's why it's taken to climate as a framework really well. It's not always great at what it tries to do, right? It makes a lot of bad guesses. It can lead us astray in like really important ways, but it makes really good guesses too, like in Stan's work, which we'll talk a lot about, I'm sure. But even I've been doing an independent study about the new wave with a student this semester, and we've been reading 70s SF, and even we read the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch from 1965, and he's talking about climate, right? The Sheep Look Up, right, from the 70s, right? John Brunner, right, predicted everything, right? He knew exactly what the 2010s and the 2020s would be like. So to me, science fiction is a really good framework to be thinking about these things, particularly with climate, which is asking us to think about the post-normal, right? To think about a world that doesn't work the way our old world used to work, both in terms of like trying to anticipate what that will be like, and then trying to find ways to like resist its worst impacts, right? I do have that kind of old school idea of like science fiction in some sense, SF as a utopian project, and often a kind of leftist project, right? Which brings us back to Stan. I mean, Ministry has framed this entire discourse around itself, appealing to so many different people. Barack Obama, right, endorsed it, right? I mean, that as an achievement to make people take climate seriously is where the potential of science fiction comes in for me. So I'm excited to talk more about that today.
If I could, Sherryl, if I could follow up on what Gerry was saying there, just briefly, because it's a good platform for talking a little bit more about how science fiction works, because I've been using an image that I think is helpful to people, that science fiction is doing two things at once, and that it is therefore somewhat like the glasses that you used to wear at 3D movies, back when there were 3D movies. The two lenses are doing two different things, and you are looking through both of them at once. Through one lens, there is an honest attempt to predict one possible future, a scenario. So you really are engaged in prophecy, and this could happen, this might happen, this will happen. That mode is ancient and powerful. But the other lens is a metaphor for how things feel right now. So it feels like time is accelerating or slowing down. It feels like I've become a robot, or in Gerry cases, a cyborg. We're all cyborgs now. Um, um, these two, when they coexist and you look through both of them, you get a false third dimension, in this case, the fourth dimension of time. You see history. You have a vision of now, you have a vision of a future, and you see the trajectory between the two. And that's what science fiction does as an aesthetic instrument. Well, it's a little complex. It's great for academics. It always involves a double reading, one lens against the other. And double readings are inherent pretty much to all reading, but very foregrounded in what we do in science fiction. It's complicated enough that I can tell you that many a person has felt compelled to come up to me and say, well, I don't read science fiction. I can't read science fiction. I stopped reading science fiction when I was 10. As soon as they hear that that's what I do, they feel compelled to tell me that. And I feel like, okay, well, I'm sorry for you. Everybody's different. Only 25% of the adult populace really reads fiction at all. So no harm, no foul. But I'm thinking they are like those people in the movies who always get a headache, that they can't make the two come into one, and they're simply seeing two images hitting their head at once. Why should that be fun? And so there you have your famous, I can't read science fiction response. For the people who get it, it's sophisticated, it's powerful, and it's a lot of fun too, because you have to decode, you have to read deeply.
Thank you so much. I've read you use that image, and I've used it in my teaching. I think it's like such a great way to capture and not only to capture how science fiction is commenting on contemporary problems, but also that utopian edge that Gerry was gesturing to, right? Where it's also about, okay, well, if we're seeing the future we're making in our choices in the present, what are we going to do about that? So it reminds me of something else, Stan, that I've heard you say or seen in an interview maybe, which is you talk about the science fiction novel we're all writing together as we're living with one another. And I really felt that resonate a lot when I was reading The Ministry for the Future. And I know Gerry has a lot to say about The Ministry for the Future, but I wondered if you had something that you might want to add along those lines about your, I don't want to give away any spoilers of what happens in the novel, but the ways, that's fine.
Yeah, spoil away.
Spoil away.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I, anyways, as a reader of The Ministry for the Future, really appreciated thinking of it in that science fiction novel we're all writing together way is that it's not just planetary in that way. Science fiction often imagines like, you know, timeframes beyond the human, or like the entire planet under a world government or something like that, but it's actually planetary in the sense that we're all trying to muddle through right now, that we are living through climate change. It's affecting places unevenly. There's a history to that. We have to be able to have conversations with one another to figure out what it means to govern on a planetary level. But yet we don't, you know, have like the day the earth stood still and some aliens to come along and just like fix that up for us. So yeah, it really was about how to participate in that project, it seemed to me. So that's my sense of one of the things that's really important about that novel. And I wondered what other thoughts along those lines you might have.
Well, I want to hear what Gerry has to say about it, but what I'd say about it is, about your first comment, I've been saying for a long time, we're all in a science fiction novel together that we are co-writing. And someone recently corrected me and said, well, it's not just one novel. It's like 8 billion science fiction novels that are palimpsested on each other, and it's kind of a mess, which it is. But what I meant to gesture towards is that feeling that you get that everything has speeded up, that we are in a relationship with the planet, even as an individual, that 5 years from now, things will feel completely different and there'll be a whole new set of technologies. And that acceleration of history is sort of a science fictional vibe, that we're already 1 foot far into the future. And the shadow of futurity, as Shelley put it, is kind of heavy on us. And then also all of us in our individual lives have a do science fiction work on the personal level of the utopian imaginary. If I do these things, I'll get to a good place. The dystopian fears, if, this is kind of the 3 a.m. without the right biochemicals in your head. If everything's going to hell and if things go wrong, it will be so bad. So everybody does the basic binary of science fiction imagining for their own life. Then it scales up to the social, and you get this activity that we do together that we call history, also very science fictional. So yes, I'll stop there and hand it over to Gerry, but I'll say this: I wrote Ministry for the Future intending to suggest all these things, that feeling in particular, the feel of it. But I wrote it in 2019, and as I was finishing it, suddenly the pandemic hit, and I was just stunned. I was as stunned as anybody else, or more so. And I thought, well, my book is instantaneously obsolete, like even before publication. But now I'm thinking that, in fact, the pandemic has slapped us in the face, and with the extra realization, well, we are in a science fiction novel now, and respect for science fiction, awareness of it as what would you call it, a structure of feeling or a mode of apprehension, is just stronger than ever. And I believe that's part of why the response to my ministry novel has been so strong.
I would definitely say that the good luck you had of an October release date that was able to incorporate tiny references to 2020 made such a difference for that issue, right? To make it feel like it was happening instantaneously. My students were, every time you mention the blip in carbon that happened in 2020 or the pandemic or things like that, they felt like disoriented, because they're like, how can the book be talking about this instant, right? And I thought it really helped them connect it to, I mean, it's only meant to take place in 2023, 2024, at least the kind of opening chapters. And it really felt to them like, a handbook to the next, the next 4 or 5 years, that they felt like it was coming out of the present, even though, realistically, I think anybody reading the book can tell, right, that you didn't write the book during the pandemic. It came out during the pandemic, but it has these traces of the pandemic that were able to be inserted in it that I think really help make it feel magical. I don't know. It's a vertiginous experience, I think, to be reading something that seems to know the history you're in, right? So well.
Yeah. Well, I did get lucky with that. At the very last second, in the copy editing phase, when they're setting the galleys, I talked it over with my editor, my wonderful editor, Tim Holman of Orbit Books. I've worked with for the last 6 books, and I love him dearly. And we talked it over, and I said, should I even make any reference to it? And he said, geez, you might as well. It'll be a good idea for the very reason that Gerry just outlined. So we crammed in a sentence here, a sentence there, referring back to, the 2020 incident, without going into much detail, because I was still so flabbergasted. I didn't even know how to characterize it. So yeah, the timing did get lucky there, because it was really a week or 2 before they were going to set the book into type.
But if I could be so bold, I mean, part of it is luck of timing, but part of it is the things you talk about in Ministry for the Future are more visible to us in the wake of the pandemic, but they certainly pre-exist the pandemic in terms of global and racial inequalities, the relationship between biosystems or biospecies destruction and ecosystem erasure and risk to human health. So I mean, I think it's that stereoscopic vision coming through as well. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted it to be an everything novel. And this is, Gerry mentioned Sheep Look Up by John Brunner. He had 4 books in the early 70s, the Stand on Zanzibar Quartet, sometimes called. And they all 4 were using John Dos Passos's method from the USA trilogy of the 1920s. So high modernist methods being used for near future speculation. And he got everything right. Not really, but the feeling is phenomenally accurate to what then transpired afterwards. So this was a great act of science fiction, and I wanted to try an everything book of that kind. I had used the Dos Passos method myself in 2312 back in 2012. And so I was aware what a capacious and flexible instrument it is for writing a novel about a whole society. So, and then the thing that slapped me was these new findings that if you get to a wet bulb temperature of 35, wet bulb 35, then people simply die. So there had been academic talk of an adaptation. Well, we're not going to make the 2-degree centigrade limit. We're going to overshoot it, but people are adaptable. It'll just be a cost. And these were mostly economists or people in the humanities. They were not biologists or ecologists. And they were just like, we'll just adapt. Humans are adaptable. Well, they're not. They actually, I mean, since most of you are in Riverside, Palm Desert, I came from Orange County. I spent time in Palm Desert. I'm in the Central Valley. You know what it's like. When it's hot, it's really hot. But when it's dry heat, you sweat. It evaporates. You cool down. You can survive. We are actually quite good at tolerating dry heat. But humid heat, as everybody says, especially from the Midwest, very tediously, it's not the heat, it's the humidity. And like most sayings, that's not quite right. It's the combination of the heat and the humidity together that becomes deadly at a certain heat index, and they've measured it. They know what it'll do to people, and unless you're in a power grid and in air conditioning, you will die in a few hours. Well, I thought this needs to be told because we are hurtling towards a world in which those temperatures will strike down frequently, not just in the tropics. One of the highest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded was outside of Chicago, but the tropics are in extra danger, and they've got a couple billion people, and they've got weak electrical grids. So again, the global South will take the hammer blows from things that the global North has done. And we're all on the same planet, and even the global North, especially with the poles heating up the way they are, will be equally endangered by this onrushing catastrophe. So that's why I had to seize this big, clumsy kind of 19th century instrument, you know, the social novel, the science fiction novel, exposition and people explaining things and all of the, what would you call it? The clutter that comes along with that style of novel. I simply had to use it to get across this particular scenario.
Well, and it's certainly that opening scene, the structure of feeling, as you were saying, it powerfully stays with you. And sorry, Gerry, you were going to say.
I was going to ask about it too, because I think it's the most kind of grim or grotesque thing you've written. I mean, there's a lot of violence in other moments. This, you know, the space elevator collapsing is a moment of catastrophe and things like that. But the way the camera is just in the middle of the disaster from the perspective of this one person who's, you know, mind you essentially see destroyed by what they witness. It's a fascinating moment for like the Kim Stanley Robinson novel to begin in that place, as opposed to in some of the other places you've been in the past. I don't know. I was curious just if you thought about that as a kind of like, I mean, it's almost your version of a kind of horror moment, right? Or horror scene in terms of the you know, the final mass of bodies with only one survivor in the middle of the lake.
Yeah, well, it was very painful. It was a struggle. I felt it had to be done. And I also, I'm far enough along in my career. It's maybe, you know, novel 15 or whatever. I don't count, and it's hard to know how to count when you've got trilogies, etc. But in any case, I've done so many novels that I have a readership, and my readership knows that I'm going to do strange things. And but they have a sense of what a Kim Stanley Robinson novel will do and what it won't. There were boundaries of safety when you read a novel by me that aren't going to be transgressed typically. It's a bunch of scientists trying to save the world. It's relatively, I mean, I'm not saying that it's removed from the pains of this world at all. I wouldn't want to do that. But nevertheless, there's a sort of sense of what I would focus in on. But in this case, I felt like I had to, because I knew that they would hang with me, to just punch my readership on the nose with the onrushing disaster is so bad that we have to take it on. We can't look away. And to live it, well, I put it in on the head of an American aid worker. A young man, naive, a little unworldly, trying to do the right thing by joining aid work in India, actually from Jacksonville, Florida, a very hot and steamy place. Should have been used to it. And so he needed to be my point of view character to go through and experience that horrific. I think it's right to call it horrific, but the thing is, it's completely realist scene. It's what will happen. You don't have to invoke anything magical or supernaturally horrific. It's just what will happen if you get to that temperature. It seemed important, and it obviously leaves a mark. It certainly was painful to write.
And Gerry, I wanted, before I pose another question, you said you had lots of things you wanted to say about Ministry for the Future. So I just wanted to give you some space to do that if you have more to say.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Ministry. I was just self-interrogating myself because I realized that I think my favorite novel of yours is still Aurora, which also has some real body horror in it. So I'm curious now if I'm betraying my own utopian nature by enjoying the grim, violent stuff too. I just taught it, and so I had a bunch of questions from my students that I wanted to kind of float as I had an opportunity. I think I'll start with one that is, you don't have to talk about the ending in particular, but I was kind of curious about how you balance character and event in a novel like this, right? You've talked about how the novel is the kind of whole society novel, but there is a character that we kind of follow through, right? And at some point the character almost leaves the narrative of the book and goes off to do her own thing, right? And the story continues in one place and we kind of follow her out into retirement. And I was really kind of curious why you chose that as a technique there at the end. I have my own ideas, but I wanted you to kind of, I'm curious why Ministry has that path.
Well, thanks for that. I knew I was going to be dumping a whole bunch of stuff on the table in a mess, a chaotic mess of material, and I needed a through line. And I thought Mary, who is the minister for the future, has that job, is my organizing principal and my main character, and then Frank, the poor young aid worker, who is devastated by his experience in India. The two of them become entwined. That's a story that is maybe novella length or a very short novel that is the spine of Ministry for the Future. So that I think all novel readers, and I'm a fanatical novel reader, wants to have characters that they care about, that they can follow through a story. Once you dispense with that, you begin to get into experimental novels, various kinds of sophisticated and chancy, because they might be more cerebral, because you don't have those characters that you can invest your emotions into. So I had Mary and Frank as the basic spine of the story, and I stuck with them. In fact, as the story goes on, the return to them becomes more and more rapid. So it's quite diffuse at the beginning. Well, not right at the beginning because you introduce them, but then it gets really diffuse, and then it begins to target back into those two, and especially Mary as the sole survivor. But I will, and I could go on, but what I want to say is the eyewitness account was for me the great discovery for this novel in formal terms. If it's a pile of junk on the table thrown in front of you as a reader to pick through, the thing that you'll see when you're reading it is that someone will tell you what they saw. And an eyewitness account is not like a novelistic scene at all. It's not a dramatized scene where you say what you ate that morning for breakfast and what you got dressed in, and the incidentals that signal that you're reading fiction. Eyewitnesses don't do that. They say, look, I was out there on the street, and then the tanks rolled, and I saw this and I saw that. It's often asked years later. Eyewitnesses are asked 20 years later, what did you see on that day that was so important? So they also judge it. And they say, this happened to me and this was what it means for my life, for the world. So a very specific genre, and I began to read tons of collections of them, of real ones. And they're fascinating. They're as interesting as anything, and they go really fast. So they're information dense. So once I found the eyewitness account as a genre for this novel, there probably are, I would guess, maybe 40 eyewitness accounts, and then a perpetual return to Mary and Frank. So that, along with a whole bunch of other different kinds of storytelling forms, that's the basic structure I came to. It was basically form following function, in the sense that I needed to invent a form to get done what I wanted to do, but I didn't want to abandon the novel and have just a gigantic case book. And this is we don't need to pursue this, but my great teacher and friend Ursula K. Le Guin, one of the greatest novelists that we've had and one of the greatest science fiction writers by a long shot, well, her book Always Coming Home has an encyclopedia structure based on her father's great book, Handbook of the California Indians. Well, it does not work compared to Left Hand of Darkness or The Dispossessed. And I believe it was a formal error on her part to abandon that through line of the characters that you want to know what happens next to them. So I was very aware of that as I went about ministry.
I have a question in the Q&A that I was a question that my students have about preaching to the choir, right? Like, you can't make the climate deniers read this book. And so I'm kind of curious how you navigate that in your own sense of your own audience. If I may, I mean, some of those eyewitness accounts that you talk about are people who aren't happy with your politics, right? One of the chapters that stands out to me is the people who are the victims of the half Earth idea, who are like, oh, yeah, you're destroying my town, right? Like they understand, they have accepted in some sense what's happening to them, but there's a sadness to them having to leave this place that they're attached to, that leaps off the page, right? Even as you can understand, right, why it has to happen. I mean, the chapter ends with them kind of mourning something that's being lost and kind of uselessly promising to each other that maybe in a generation or two, somebody will be able to come back to this spot.
Well, there's a lot of loss and pain in that novel, I must say, because I had to live it and write it and go through it, whatever, 15 to 20 times per sad incident. And I noticed that because I wanted it to be a best case scenario novel, but one that you could believe in. So sticking to the utopian impulse of we can make a better world, that's the basic utopian impulse. But if I say that now in our day and age, can I still make you believe it? And what I notice now reading the book retrospectively or leafing through it, which is really what I've done, every time something good happens, it's followed by something really horrible happening. And so I think it's unconscious, deliberate stabbing of expectations. Like, things can get better, but it doesn't mean that death is going to go away. So you have to keep a balanced view of all this. Now, in terms of preaching to the choir, I write a novel about climate change. Are there people in the world who don't believe in climate change? I'm dubious about that. I know there are people who might claim that. I know there are people who might object that it's been politicized. I know there are people who say, but oh, it always happens. There's been a shift from climate denialism to doomism. And Michael Mann, the climate scientist, is very good on this. The move is, it's not happening, it's not happening, it's not happening. It's happening, but we can't do anything about it. Let's just go down with the ship. Let's party. So in the political world that we're in now, you simply have to write for people who are going to read novels. And people who are going to read novels, they are engaged in the experiment of, I'm going to see what the other person feels like, to be the other person. So you read a novel, you are entering someone else's thinking in another time and place. It's very magical. It's very science fictional. You read a novel, you're doing time travel because you're in a different time and place, past or future. And you're also in someone else's head. That's telepathy, very rare. So fiction readers are already in a special category of bold and creative thinkers, because they have to do a lot of the work. When they're reading a novel, they read these black marks on the page, and then they have to have something. It's extremely creative and generous on the part of readers. So I don't suppose that I'm going to be read by too many climate deniers, but I don't worry about that. And when you're doing political novels, which I think everybody is, but I like to think that I'm doing it on purpose also, what you're thinking about, I think, is rhetoric of persuasion, and then also trying to put people into a temporary dream state of reading fiction where when they're out of it, they understand the other better than they did before, and then they make their own political conclusions. And I sometimes I'm accused of being heavy-handed. Other times I'm accused of being confused. And my characters have different opinions than I do, and they have different opinions than the other characters do. So it is a test. Can you do a political novel and not be too heavy-handed? It's a constant test, and I try to keep that as in mind when I'm writing.
So I'm just going to mention now to the audience, we're going to transition to taking questions from the Q&A. So by all means, type in your questions. And Gerry already brought one into the conversation, which his students apparently also had that question. So that's curious that that's the common question. So our first question I'm going to read out is from Evan Brook, who says, "Hi, Gerry and Stan, thank you for being here. I read Ministry for the Future immediately after listening to your interview with Ezra Klein. The book actually made the premise of planetary government realistic. However, it seems that public sense making and discourse are breaking down. How do political problems get unclogged and moral responsibility recognized such that the global North can form a union with the global South?" So small questions we're starting out with here.
That's a good question. I took the working method of saying that the Paris Agreement is the platform for working out this problem that's described in the question, for which thanks. So the Paris Agreement has a couple of clauses where climate equity is insisted on as part of the solution. And a shared but differentiated responsibilities is a phrase that they hammered out with a wicked rhetorical battles into the middle of the night to get every comma and word right. And what shared and but differentiated responsibilities means is that the developed global North, the rich nations, need to pay more. And the poor nations, which are often post-colonial, so that they got ripped off during the 19th and 20th century and are still in a kind of neo-post-colonial position and don't have the financial capacity to pay for what needs to be done there, they get help from the global North. Now, it's very idealistic. No nation wants its money going to other nations, including populations that are quite sophisticated and generous. It's one of those statements that needs to be lived up to and often is not lived up to. So you say something good and then you don't live up to it. The Paris Agreement could become like the League of Nations. And what I mean by that is a good idea that failed, and then after that was a complete disaster for humanity. That could happen to the Paris Agreement too. But if we take that historical lesson seriously, and if we take what the Paris Agreement says seriously, and the nation states come together and all of them signed it, and we are in it full bore now with the Biden administration and with John Kerry as the climate leader there, good things could happen. I'll just end by saying that I'm seeing things happen that in the Ministry for the Future I had described as happening in the 2030s or the 2040s under huge duress, and they're happening now. And so I'm thinking, what's with that? I think the duress is the pandemic. I think the pandemic scared people into an awareness that we are on one planet together and we depend on the biosphere, and that everything can be shut down, and that it's clear it's fragile, that food supplies could go away like toilet paper, and then we're all in terrible trouble. So I'm seeing things at the level of central banks, and what Gerry mentioned, the habitat corridors of emptying out land. Things are happening on those fronts that I would have said had no chance for another decade. And yet now they're actively policy considerations. So maybe there's reasons for hope that are kind of new in history.
And Gerry, do you have thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I think the pandemic also opened up space for, I mean, the idea that the government could just send people money when they're desperate, right, is now suddenly on the table when it wasn't for decades, right? The idea that you could make unemployment livable, right? And you know, we're experimenting now with direct cash transfer, which was always considered impossible, and now maybe just with us, right? So the pandemic, because of its severity, also opened up spaces. One thing that ministry does really well is note, right, for better or for worse, that you don't necessarily need to look to like the imperial metropole to be the leaders on this. Like India becomes the leader for global planetary democracy. One of the key utopian moments is the Chinese finance minister just kind of changing their opinion about carbon currency, right, and opening the door to let certain things happen. There are movements from below, like the debt strikes and things like that, right? And America and Russia, as these kinds of, rump imperial powers, are the problem for most of the novel, right? That they are the drag on everybody else knowing what to do, right? And there's something about reorienting ourselves in that way that I think the novel does really well, right? It's not really a novel about Americans, right?
No, it isn't. Absolutely not. There's Frank, who is an American, but he's a man without a country. Part of his post-traumatic stress syndrome is to reject what education he had when this event happens to him. So he spends the rest of his life in Switzerland, more or less by coincidence, or going to the place of power to see if he can do some individual asymmetric terroristic type action. So what I would say as an American is we have a huge potential for doing good that would need for us to seize a working majority's ability to do things like FDR and the New Deal in the 30s, a kind of Keynesian exertion of the state and of national government in the service of pulling the world together and through a crisis. So I'm very interested. Right now I'm reading The Price of Peace. I recommend it to all of you. It's about Keynes by Zachary Carter, and it's a granular history of the New Deal and of Keynes's influence on world history. And now when people talk about modern monetary theory, I think this is a way of trying to express Keynes for our time. And it includes an insistence on a job guarantee that gets to this matter of inequality and full employment as a way to make sure that everybody has dignity and adequacy. So there are really exciting things going on that can happen in America. And if they did, that would be the leadership again of a way, showing the world a way that one nation state could make it work. And since we are the second biggest carbon burn and by far the biggest collection of capital, in combination, what we do here is stupendously important. So that United States, China, European Union, and then the BRIC countries. And India is super interesting because it is a democracy and it's 1 billion people. And what happens there will matter hugely. So yes, I tried to make it an international novel, which when you say that, you see immediately the craziness of it. But sometimes you have to do that. This is what science fiction is good for. Instead of saying international novel, which if you're thinking of the ordinary novel, you're going, well, how does that even work? And your brain explodes. But if you're thinking science fiction, then you think, well, that means planetary novel, that's standard operating procedure. So again, science fiction saves the day.
Fantastic. And I think our next question follows very nicely from that, which is, of all your work, Stan, and Gerry, I'll invite you to chime in if you want to make a recommendation too, because I know you've read it all. What's the best writing about the future, especially for non-SF readers? It's a question from Robert Heath.
Yeah, well, it might be Ministry for the Future because that's so day after tomorrow. If you're not a science fiction reader, there's nothing in it that is classically science fictional, being so close to the present. I've written a historical novel, The Years of Rice and Salt, kind of a monster. I could just throw you in the deep end of the pool with a novel of Aurora, very much what science fiction does, but maybe it would be a kind of a way of seeing what science fiction can do. I wrote 3 novels, and one of them I would recommend to anyone, since you just pop over the hill and you're in Orange County, the Gold Coast, about what it felt like to be in Orange County in the 1970s when I was young. The defense industry, the drug industry, the craziness of Orange County and of LA. So I like the Gold Coast. And beyond that, I find this a confusing question to answer because I'm sort of like stuck inside these books to the point where I don't know what they look like from the outside. If really science fiction strikes you as a little bizarre, then I wonder if Shaman. I wrote a novel set in the Paleolithic about the people who painted the Chauvet cave, which was discovered in 91 in the center of France. So that's set 32,000 years ago. And the question there is, what were we like before civilization and writing and everything else? What the people who painted those caves, their DNA was identical to ours, but what were their lives like? So if that kind of thing intrigues you, then I've touched on that as well.
My old teacher, Mary Grimm, in the chat is recommending 40 Signs of Rain, a different climate novel, which is another one that anticipated the potential shutting down of the Gulf Stream, which is now potentially being monitored. You didn't say New York 2140. That's the one I almost taught. New York City is such a space that we all know because of mass culture, that to see it flooded like Venice is stunning and really interesting. For the non-SF reader, I actually have it handy. I might be able to show it on camera. There's a great edition of a very early short story you wrote called The Lucky Strike from the Outspoken Author series, which is a Hiroshima story. The plane that was supposed to bomb Hiroshima, the Enola Gay, crashes in a test, and a different flight has to go, and the bombardier on that flight is an older gentleman. He's not 18, he's in his 20s or 30s, and maybe he's in his 40s, and he just decides, I don't want to bomb an open city, and so he pretends the bomb mechanism breaks and drops the bomb 20 miles past Hiroshima. Nobody dies, and you spiral out this whole possible vision of what the world could be out of that. And then that edition has a great essay you wrote, which spirals it out in all sorts of other ways, with this really tremendous thing about just like, none of us know the future. Science fiction doesn't know the future. All you know is what you're doing in this moment. Are you going to drop that bomb or not? And I love to teach that book. So I would recommend that one. If you're not an SF person, that one is historical fiction, alt historical fiction that I think might speak to you. But I will say that one of the pleasures of being a Kim Stanley Robinson fan is how often the coordinates of the different books recur in other ones, and you see, you fiddling with the knobs a little bit, and like this one turns up the dystopia a little bit higher, this one turns up the immediacy a little bit higher, and you see these things in conversation. So you got to read multiple Kim Stanley Robinson novels to get the full picture. So that would be my full answer.
That may be asking a little much, but I'm very glad that you mentioned all those books, but particularly I had forgotten New York 2140. This is kind of a trollop novel in sense of its format. And there's The Lucky Strike. My friend Terry Bisson runs a wonderful series for PM Press, where he has a short story and then an essay and then an interview. And we are friends, and the group of people he gathers for that series is quite good. But in New York 2140, I would say this is an apartment novel of extremely conventional format, with ideas lifted out of Dickens' Bleak House, and very much, as Gerry pointed out, a New York novel where every American knows their New York because of culture. And I was surprised to find that I knew New York pretty better than I thought I did, being a California boy. And I think of it as a comedy of coping. So yes, it has some climate change, but I want the vibe of it to be what I mean by apartment novel is you have a novel in which every character lives in the same apartment building. They don't know each other at first. By the end of the book, they do know each other. And it's a simple but very effective format for a novel of character, and character arcs all over the place, but mainly arcs that come together in a way that I hope is pleasing. And that one was very much more fun to write than some of these other books I've written recently.
Well, I've taught New York 2140 to great success. Students really respond well to it. And it's a novel about death strikes, so we need that as well as we need to think about climate crisis. So
it's true.
So our next question is from Justice Hagen, who asks, is there some link between how far an SF text looks into the future and the immediacy of its cultural impact? thinking about Ministry, looking several years into the future versus something like Dune, looking 25,000 years into the future?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you for that. Science fiction can be broken down temporally into subgenres. Near future is very different from space opera. And the mental games you play in the two are quite different. So I think there probably is a difference, but Dune had a big impact. So why? It's fun to look at that. It was about ecology. It was about planets. And it also overlaid the story of Muhammad, so that there was a hero quest type thing going on. And for the baby boomers, such as myself, reading it when it came out, it was a story of how to, it was high adventure and it was exotic. So you could get away from thinking about the Vietnam War and pollution. So on the one hand, there was escape. On the other hand, there was engagement with the idea of ecology. Like, okay, we have to get away from our own personal difficulties with our draft number and think about the larger planetary picture and behave heroically, and everything will come out okay in the end. And so it had its impact. And quite a weird novel, Dune. I just reread it a few years ago for anniversary and talk about it on NPR. I believe that Herbert, it was his first true novel, that he taught himself to write novels while he was writing Dune, so that it's strangely better in the last quarter than it is in the first quarter. But whatever. One more thing about space opera, my late friend Ian Banks, in his Culture series, so he's a Scottish writer, Ian M. Banks, his space operas are all about how do you defend a utopian ideas against attacks, and what kind of attacks will there be, and why are people uncomfortable with the idea that we might get to post-scarcity, that everybody could be at adequacy? Why should some people object to that? And he has about 8 or 10 novels in his Culture series that are exploring these things, but they are larks. They are wild. He was imaginative. He was funny. You read his novels and you're kind of in an escapism, but you realize that it's, again, in this double vision, it's always about good things, interesting things.
That question makes me think a little bit of some of the editions of Philip K. Dick novels I have from the 90s, where they would go back and give him another 30 years. So if he said 1992 in the first novel, they'd like cross it out and put like 2019, right? So that it felt current again. And we did actually talk about this one day in my class about Ministry, right? Like it has a feeling of like a Netflix event, right? Like we'll watch this book now, we'll all talk about it now, and like what will it be to read Ministry in 2027 versus New York 2140, where you gave yourself a little bit more runway, right, in terms of its like possible obsolescence, right? Like there is a kind of audaciousness to write a novel that's so near future compared to some of the other ones you've done.
It will begin to look weird and wrong in ways that will be interesting. And I've got to say this, when you look back at old science fiction, it's always wrong about the future. I mentioned my novel, The Gold Coast. I published it in 1988, and in that novel, the Soviet Union is going on forever. For 100 years later, we still got the Soviet Union. I published it in 88. In 1989, it was completely wrong. And it has videotapes. People, there's no cell phones. There's automated cars, but they actually work like slot cars from when I was a kid. There's in short, it's a mess, but interesting to look back on, to see what can be seen about the future and what can't be seen about the future. And what it is a novel about 1988. What did it feel like in 1988? With Dune, what did it feel like in 1968? And so science fiction as a diagnostic of how people felt about their future possibilities in their present of that time, nothing can beat it. It's a primary source for how that time felt. And so I don't worry about it anymore. The strange clunkiness of Foundation or any of the other old science fiction classics, sometimes they're just truly clunky. Other times they're quite great, and yet they always are of their moment.
Well, that is a great transition to our next question, because it is about pedagogy in science fiction. So this is from Graham Slater, who asks about the pedagogical function of science fiction in relation to cultural politics of climate change. Is estrangement effect a central concept for thinking about this function? And he would love to hear from both of you on this. Thank you.
Gerry, why don't you go?
Sure. I like that question a lot. It's sort of what I was saying to begin, right? That climate is a problem because the world of our childhoods or the world that we grew up in is gone, and our intuitions about what's possible and what might happen are wrong in many cases, right? It requires us to understand the world as a kind of alien planet in some ways, right? And that maybe that's just what future shock is. Like, it happens to everybody. You live long enough and you can't recognize the world anymore. But I think for the people who are alive now, this is happening in short order, right? That we're having to deal with things like what happened in Texas a few weeks ago, where a slight variation outside the normal temperature range caused catastrophic infrastructure damage that will take years to rebuild from, right? And it wasn't that far outside the norm, but it was just enough to really challenge what we've built. And there's a million examples of this, planes that aren't able to fly because it's 121 degrees in Phoenix, right? And they're not coded to fly at that temperature, right? We're just seeing all of these elements of our world that seem stable turn out to have parameters that we didn't expect. And so I think a lot of our world we are estranged from it because we're anticipating a certain level of stability that we may not be able to count on.
The estrangement effect is crucial to science fiction. That's what Darko Suvin taught us back in his early anatomy of what science fiction does. And so it comes out of Brecht, and you're reading a book that isn't trying to give you the world that you know, but is slapping you in the face with a world that you don't know. And then you begin the game of figuring out how it speaks to you as a person in your life. So science fiction is always doing that. Now that we're already in climate change, if you're doing near future science fiction, you kind of can't avoid it without doing something bizarre. I mean, I wrote a story called Glacier. Once again, 1988, my year of predicting wrongly. I had an ice age hitting Boston in a short story called Glacier that it amuses me a lot now. But what I think you could do in pedagogical terms is assign J.G. Ballard, writing about this in the 60s, and in this spacey, beautiful, surrealistic, Ballard was kind of welcoming, anything to wipe out suburbia in his own life. He welcomed the disaster. And then the Brunner books, and do a historical thing, how people were writing about it. And then you can also choose the dystopian, like, okay, climate change comes, we're all in terrible trouble, it's going to turn into The Walking Dead. Or you can, and here, this is why I think people are drawn to my Ministry for the Future. If you say, well, I want to do a climate change book where everything still comes out okay, you're a little short on subject material of books to assign. But with New York 2140 and with Ministry, I've done that. And I note there's a new young crowd of science fiction writers, a lot of them based out of Arizona State. And in Phoenix, they're very aware of this problem. And so Arizona State has a Center for Science and the Imagination that runs contests and supports young writers. And sometimes they call it solar punk. Sometimes it's just the new utopians. And they're trying to put positive spin on how we can cope, and how actually by coping, we'll get rid of some of the injustices, some of the badnesses of the previous system. So that by being forced to cope with climate change, we also make some social justice as part of the necessary fix. Well, that gets really interesting. And in terms of pedagogy, if you're running classes like Sherryl and Gerry do, well, then the students can go at it, and they're the ones that are going to live into that future. So.
Fantastic, thank you. And our next question actually gets at some of the difficulty of that. What does it take to imagine things turning out okay? So this is a question from Andrew Hoffman, who says, I was wondering about the inclusion of the Black Ops section of the Ministry. This is something that seems to terrify ideologues on the right, in that they call even peaceful protests on, let's say, the Keystone Pipeline. Presumably they call that a riot when it's a peaceful protest, or maybe it's they call the police on even peaceful protesters. So obviously you anticipated a negative response, and what was the strategy there?
Well, I'm going to be interested to hear what Gerry says about this, because he wrote about this early on in probably the first review. The Los Angeles Review of Books review did a lot of good for that book, and I thank Gerry for that. For my purposes, I wanted to write a kind of double novel in a different way. Mary's story is about trying to do things peacefully by rule of law and by diplomacy and by persuading people to do the right thing in their own self-interest. Her assistant Badim has a secret novel inside the Ministry for the Future that the reader has to read off various short moments in the text and wonder, as a detective might wonder in a detective story, is there a black wing in the ministry that's doing these things? And then, black wing or not, there's the children of Kali, some very angry young people, maybe from India, maybe not, who are attacking in resistance fighter style the worst of the fossil fuel refuseniks that continue to burn fossil fuel when it's clearly going to devastate the generations to come. So I wrote a very conflicted and confused text, and I'd say that the future is going to be very conflicted and confused, so I don't feel too guilty. But I wish I had made a clearer distinction between sabotage and murder. And I wish I had I wish I had read Andreas Malm. Andreas Malm, a Swedish philosopher, just published a book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Well, this is not a guidebook into how to blow up a pipeline like Dave Foreman's Ecotage from 1999 or whatever. This is a philosophical meditation. To what lengths are we justified in going if we need to do these things to save the future generations from a complete devastation? And sabotage, a breaking of property that does bad things, it's hard to figure what the moral objection to that might be. In my novel, it's all murky and confused together, I think.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's so great about it. There is, I can imagine Samuel Delaney's review of The Dispossessed, where he directs our attention not to Shevik, but to Badap, his Shevik's friend, who's like, this is the real hero of the story, right? Like, this is the revolutionary who changes everything, and the book is looking in the wrong place. And I could easily imagine a 99-page review of Ministry that's about Badim, and it's just like, this is where the core of the novel is, and Mary's doing her thing, and Frank is doing his thing, but he's the fascinating figure. And there's some really fascinating chapters about that character and the things that they're getting up to. Reading it the second time to teach it, I found the key sentence, which is Frank's ruminating that there are poisons that work at 1 part per billion, right? And climate change, carbon is a poison that works that way. Like 450 parts per million is enough to utterly destabilize our planet, right? And so there's lots of things individuals can do. Some of them are within the rule of law and some of them are not. Some of them are murderous, right? I mean, Crash Day seems like a super effective way to change people's transportation habits. It's murderous and horrible, right? But what are the costs? It's a really fraught and difficult thing. My students love to talk about it, right? And it's very easy to be happy about them poisoning cows so nobody eats meat. And you can maybe work yourself up to being like, well, I can find the 50 worst eco polluters and maybe make some tough choices in my own mind. But there's people doing things in the novel that seem so far beyond the pale. Effective or not. And I just think, you have a million voices, and some of them are saying rule of law will do it, and others of them are saying rule of law is not enough. And, you're kind of in that murky middle in a really interesting way. The question mentioned the ideologues on the right. I think ideologues on the left are actually kind of terrified about this question, right? Because Frank's argument is persuasive, right? That, it's if the choice is between like this beautiful defeat where you tried your best, but the filibuster stopped you from saving the world, and taking different sorts of action, the man makes a good case, right? And it does seem to persuade Mary at some level that to open the door to less savory methods, right?
I read aloud. This is Terry Bisson again. He runs SF in SF, Science Fiction in San Francisco. And for 10 or 12 years in a row, Cecilia Holland and I have been the January meeting, and it's the same crowd every year. It's a kind of a It's a little community, possibly like the one we're talking to now when we meet live. So this was before it was published, and I decided to read the apartment scene where Frank has kidnapped Mary and is convincing her and is yelling at her that she isn't doing enough, being that the ministry for the future isn't doing enough, and that it will fail unless she does something more drastic. So I'm reading this scene aloud, and I almost completely lost it. I was shouting. I was thinking, I was pinching myself. I was saying, look, Charles Dickens can cry on stage reading his own work. You cannot cry on stage while you're reading your own work. In this structure of feeling, that is not okay. But I was shaking. I'm not an actor, but I had got locked into that scene, and I definitely was shouting into a microphone. I saw the whole audience jump, but mainly just because I had shouted too loudly. But also I caught them unawares. And so that scene is probably one of the cruxes of the book, the argument. And so I think, it's a tool for thought. The book doesn't have answers. It's a tool for thinking through these issues. And the violence issue, well, what I want to say now, and this is something my wife taught me to say, is I'm not advocating violence. I'm saying if we don't deal with this big global problem, climate change now, we're going to get violence. And then what we middle-class Americans, I'm a suburban middle-class house husband, and I like life the way it is now. I've been privileged. It will blow up in our faces. And so we need to act now. So that's partly what the book was up to.
Great answer. So I'm just going to mention we have 3 questions left, which I think will take us to our time. I'm going to do them slightly out of order because I think one of them will be a nice wrap-up question. So the next question I'm going to go to is from Nick Silcox, who says, I'm curious, Stan, and the others can speak to this as well. If you see other forms of government or political arrangements as possible or worthwhile as we continue to descend into climate crisis, or if you see liberal bureaucracy as the political arrangement best suited or necessary to climate crisis and post-crisis future, if one can even suggest that such a thing would exist.
Yeah, well, I'm going to propose a stepwise movement that always will include bureaucracy and money and the nation state system and rule of law. So there's always going to be bureaucracies running the rule of law for us. If you include also judges and the police, the bureaucracy is big. But going from anti-austerity and bringing government back in as a force for good. So that's anti-austerity moving to Keynesianism. Keynesianism moving to modern MMT, which would include a job guarantee and everybody put to work and given a job. That would change things. That would get us to something like social democracy in Scandinavia. Then I would like to see that shift to democratic socialism, eco-socialism, which would include the co-op movements. And so I would like to see governance shift through these things and the nation state system kind of devolve into city to city, regions, watersheds, get rid of the empires and begin to have maybe 400 countries in the UN in a kind of a coordinated world thing. So what I want to suggest here is that the left not fight the left. Everybody who would like to see a better world and therefore a different governing system, not immediately begin punching with the person that is next to you on the left for not being quite the same as you on the left, but regarded as a united front, and that your disagreements might be temporally based, that one of you is insisting on what it should be like 200 years from now, and one of you insisting on what it should be like 3 months from now, and that the perceived difference in ideological difference is perhaps a kind of a time shift problem, just as a way to get a united front out of it.
I like everything you just said. I'm in favor of that platform, and I'll vote for it. I think one of the major questions buried within that question is just the question of legitimacy and like, does something like liberal democracy exist in anything other than like branding for certain nation states right now, right? I mean, we're living through a legitimacy crisis where within the United States, it's very clear that by and large, democracy does not exist, right? It exists in like very particular forms, in particular moments, but it's captured by a lot of other forces, right? And so like democracy would be really good if we had it. And so like I would like us to have it in a lot of the ways you were just kind of talking about in those kinds of reforms. The other thing that I always think about with questions like this is Frederick Jameson, who was both of our teachers, has a lot of essays around thinking through, you know, the kind of Brechtian idea of like, don't start with the good old things, but start with the bad new ones, right? And thinking about, you know, what are the things now that could emerge as utopian principles in ways we don't recognize or see, right? So he has an essay about like there are things about Walmart, right? Like cheap goods distributed everywhere, right? Logistically, right? Amazon maybe now would have some, like you could imagine a utopian version of this, right? He has a great book. It's a great YouTube lecture too, where he talks about the army, right? And he's like, there are things about the army, right? Like universal inclusion, pensions, right? Healthcare, right? Like, why not just have everybody in the army? If that's what it takes to have a livable life, then we could just, you know, conscript everybody and move forward, right? So I don't know that we can necessarily know what elements of the present will become like the utopian basis of the future, but I think we should be open to different kinds of possibilities, right? And even things that seem horrible, like aspects of the internet, right, have within them this kind of like utopian possibility for like direct democracy, collaboration across like wide areas, opening up, you know, the doors of representation and things like that. So I try to have hope in those kinds of things as well. But you know, you're never going to find a system that doesn't have bureaucracy, and if it doesn't have laws, it's not going to be stable. I mean, there's a certain level of, you know, consensus reality you have to do anything. And so I think it's going to be a question of finding a way that can live in accord with the environment, and you don't wind up with little city states that pollute the water that goes downstream where they don't have to live with the consequences, right? Like that duality between the goodness of local government and the need for an overhauling thing that can say, don't poison the people who live downstream from you. You know, we're going to be working that out for a long time.
Two excellent answers. And if I may be so bold, I think they show sort of the power of science fictional thinking, right? Because it's like, this is where we want to get the long end of the road, but there's a road that we have to go on, so that we have to think of these things in stages and things like that. So our next question is from Candace Leslie Abdul Aziz, who says, as a scientist and engineer who works on solutions to help combat climate change, I often find inspiration in science fiction novels. However, in some cases, I also see that scientists are posed as either the villain or the hero. So I'm curious how the panelists see scientists' roles in the science fiction realm related to climate change. Are we the heroes or the villain, or neither?
Well, I'm going to say the heroes. I'm married to a scientist. I have spent my entire life since I got together with her in the scientific community watching it. I'm kind of a fan. I can, maybe the question is pointing out this: scientific advances of the 19th century in public health and in marshaling the energy that we got, freeing up fossil fuels, these were scientific achievements in their time that led us to the parts of the crisis that we're in now. But every time something bad has come out of scientific advances, I blame it on capitalism. Every time something good has come out of scientific advances, I say it's the science that made it possible. So I have a very Manichaean view: science good, capitalism bad. And of course, that's just a rough cut, like sock puppets or like Hindu gods. But that's my orientation.
I feel we should get some science good, capitalism bad stickers or something like this. So, Gerry.
Well, Stan, even it might have been one of the first times we met. We talked about this with respect to another novel of yours that we haven't talked about, Galileo's Dream, which is about the capture of science by capital and other sorts of institutions. And we talked a lot about the bomb and the Manhattan Project, right? And how it's very easy to have a Manhattan Project for the bomb, but not for climate, right? And some of these problems that we're still seeing. I think the ministry is great at looking at a kind of realistic vision of like what science can do. I think one of the bad implication of science fiction is that, well, we'll simply invent something that eats carbon and excretes food, and so everything will be fine. And actually, you have over the course of this decades, you have scientists working at the Arctic and the Antarctic trying to figure out a way to refreeze the poles and do an okay job of intervening a little bit, right? Like, we can't necessarily count on science to invent a miracle machine that fixes everything, right? But science can do a lot of good things for us, right? As we're all, I've had my 2 shots, and probably a lot of us have had 2 shots by now, or we're getting there, right? I mean, science comes through a lot of the times, even if you would also say, but science made the pandemic possible too, right? By creating globalism, right? Like, you always have that duality, but we can't unring the bell in some sense, right? We have 7 billion people on this planet when in the pre-scientific period, our capacity was 1 billion. So unless you're looking to get rid of 1/6 of the people, science is better be part of your plan. So
I think I want to second something you said. One can go too far and say, well, we'll just science our way out of anything, what's called scientism, as if science were magic. And that's going too far. That's a mistake in the other direction. We can't science our way out of anything. It's a human process. It's just a very smart and continuously improving set of institutions. I like science at the institutional level. And the last thing I would add is they're the ones that started waving the flag that climate change was a problem. And the first time they waved the flag multiple times, there was no reaction from the world at large. So around 2000, they had to kind of go off like a fire alarm. And the reason that we're paying attention to it now is the result of the scientific community warning of something that no individual can tell is happening. It is an AI discovery. It's science worldwide telling us what's going on. It's rather remarkable. And now everybody's believing it because of individual incidences. But yeah, go science.
Thank you. And so our final question comes from Mary Grimm, who gave us the perfect question to wrap up with, which is, what are some recommendations of other writers that you are reading who write great climate change fiction?
Climate change fiction.
I'll start. I think N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy, which had the kind of unprecedented triple Hugo victory, right, marking its significance, right? And she just got the MacArthur grant, is a really interesting one to look at. It's a little bit more allegorical and mutant superpowery, but I like it a lot. I like Cixin Liu's work. It's also kind of allegorical, but it's about humanity discovering a big problem and working together to fix it in different ways. And I always recommend Octavia Butler's Parable series because, she was writing in the 90s. The 90s were good. They felt good. It seemed like everybody was going to be rich and fine. And she had the foresight to see like what the 2020s would be like and gets the dates almost right. I mean, she's, she has people predicting it very closely and, trying to find ways to find new ideologies and new philosophies that can kind of get us through, similar to Gaia Day in ministry, right, Stan? I mean, this kind of idea that we could find new ways to think about our relationship to the planet that could help us in this predicament. So those would be my recommendations. It's like I said, it winds up being a part of almost everything now because nobody really disbelieves in it, exactly as Stan said earlier. I mean, everybody can see that the weather's not like it used to be, right? Like things are different, right? We can all remember, even if we don't want to, that it didn't used to be this way. So I think we're all trying to work it out, and almost everything you read in science fiction hits climate somehow or another.
Yeah. Everybody doing near future science fiction is interesting because they're trying to tell a story about it. I like Paolo Bacigalupi. He's great. The Water Knife is scary but realistic. Climate change future. Cory Doctorow is a wonderful utopian techno thinker. Walk Away by him is good. Jonathan Lethem just published a novel called The Arrest, about when the internet goes down everywhere on Earth and what happens when you get back into your local community. Molly Gloss wrote a great book called The Dazzle of Day, which is really a kind of again, allegorical to the situation. And all of the Brits, in fact, any British science fiction writer whose name begins with Mac, give them a try. Ian MacDonald, Paul Macaulay, Ken MacLeod. These are just 3 of about 10 Macs over there who are hot as can be and entertaining and really smart and on these issues.
Mhm.
So there's really more than you can keep up with. And oh, I want to say also this book I'm reading about Keynes, The Price of Peace by Zachary Carter. It's blowing my mind. And I would say an economic biography is not the kind of book to blow my mind. In fact, I don't even know what economic biography is. But this is Keynes's story told at the level of his life without going into his grandparents and his childhood. It just jumps right to the chase. His life as an economist. And I'm just learning so much, and it all is relevant to climate change because he had to deal with the end of World War I, a disaster, with the Great Depression, a disaster, and with World War II and Bretton Woods. So 3 times he tried to figure out ways that we could pay to do what we need to do, pay ourselves. And so that's a pretty, I guess I would say it has a globalist aspect of it that makes it kind of like reading a science fiction novel. Keynes is like some Asimovian, foundation type thinker guy. And so I'm loving that too.
I thought of 2 others, if I can, Sherryl. Sorry,
Of
we could go
course.
all night ping-ponging back and forth.
Yeah.
There's a short film I really like on YouTube called Plastic Bag, which is the interior monologue of a bag you would get at a store like Walmart over the 100,000 years it takes to decompose or not decompose. Humans disappear. It winds up in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and just has this wonderful story it tells. It's like a 12-minute film. And there's a comic book that does this, Richard McGuire's Here, where the 2 arms of the book are the 2 walls of a house. And as you flip through the book, you just see this space, this tiny little space in New Jersey over about 65 million years. Sometimes the house is there, sometimes it's not, sometimes the water level's here, sometimes it's a desert, but you just kind of get a sense of the enormity of time and the enormity of like climate time that I think is just such a powerful artistic vision. It doesn't leave you feeling sad, but it leaves you feeling, kind of in tune with the natural cycles, which is a hard thing with climate change. It feels so apocalyptic, but, it's that work kind of gets you outside of human time for a little bit. And you can kind of see that, it's not the end of the world. It's just the end of a certain way of living.
That's fantastic. I think Plastic Bag, if I'm remembering correctly, Werner Herzog is the voice.
Werner Herzog is the voice of the bag. It's so good.
Yeah, so between that and a biography of Keynes described as a sort of like Asimovian foundation character, this is like the best conversation that I've had for a long time. So I just want to thank you both so much for your time. Thank our audience for being here. And this is such an urgent conversation to have. So many great ideas being discussed within science fiction. Your work has been just so important, both of you, breaking new critical ground, Gerry, and sort of like founding the tradition of science fiction talking about environment, Stan. So thank you both so much for being here. And I'm going to turn it back over to Catherine now.
Well, and I don't want to add too much. I want to say thank you. And so much of this conversation will echo in our minds for the next event in the series, which is science fiction and economic crisis. The 2 topics are intermeshed, which we've explored here tonight. So that's May 24th at noon. I hope folks who joined us here tonight would be interested in joining us for a conversation between Malka Older and Hugh Charles O'Connell. So thank you all. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Gerry. Special thanks to Sherryl for bringing us all together into this conversation. Thanks for everyone for joining us. Be well, stay safe, make the world a better place, please.